to be here with you all tonight. My name is Reverend Tera and I love leading worship, and I would not have always said that in my lifetime. When I very first became a Unitarian Universalist back in the 90s, I couldn't imagine leading worship. One of my first roles in church was on a social justice committee, and for some reason that committee had been asked to lead a worship service, and the chair of that committee invited me to read one sentence during the worship, and I said, no, there's no way I could ever do anything like that in a service. And she was insistent and a very good mentor and got me to read that one sentence. And it grew on me, and eventually I entered seminary, and I was ordained in 2011. Today I serve two ministry positions. One is with the Pacific Southwest District of our Unitarian Universalist Association. I'm a congregational life consultant, and with my other ministry hat, I'm at Troop UU Church in Pasadena, California. And now I want to know, who are you on the other end of this platform? It's killing me that I can't actually see your faces, so I would love to know a little bit about who you are. It'll also give you a chance to play in that chat box. If you're calling in as a group, I'd like each person in the group to be able to send in an answer, even if they're not actually typing it. And so I have a few questions for our webinar check-in, and they are your name, which will show up there in the chat box anyway. I'd like to know which congregation or community you're from, what ways you serve and worship, and most importantly, what is your favorite worship hymn or song? And just get started in there. And as you type in and hit return, people's information will start popping up there on that chat box. Great. And don't forget your favorite worship hymn or song, because I'm hoping to learn of some new ones that I don't usually sing. And I see that Janet is from Tuolumne. Hope that you guys were okay when all the fires were going on. Oh, I love Bring Many Names too. That's great. And Dennis, it's nice to see you on here. As Tranquil Streams, thank you for that one. Visalia has such a lovely little meeting space. I had the opportunity to spend the night there a few years ago with a group of young adults who were on a California water justice trip. Oh, good. Have a board president on here. Wonderful. And, oh, yeah, Find a Stillness. I love that hymn. Great. Well, if people haven't yet gotten their information in there, please keep it coming. And so as you continue to check in there with our online chat, we will have a chalice lighting. And these are words taken from Barbara Peskin. Somewhere between the stars and the earth's core, we live and weep, we ask and laugh and answer. How can we not be amazed? Let the light and darkness bless each other and bless us. Amen. So as we get started here into this webinar on worship for small congregations, what kind of worship are we talking about tonight? Are we talking about traditional worship styles? And when I hear the word traditional, I think what really people are talking about are like post 1950s worship in the United States. Or maybe we're talking about contemporary worship styles, which so many of us have heard about, with rock bands and light shows and gigantic screens and amazing PowerPoint presentations. They really catch the eye. Or maybe we're going to talk about emergent worship style, which in my mind is always characterized with lots of candles and small altar stations set up throughout the worship space. There's a focus on personal, connected experience of the sacred that touch on multiple senses. It's most like the small group worship that many of our young people experience in youth ministry, or perhaps that adults experience when you go on things like a special camp retreat weekend, or if you do a leadership retreat with folks in your congregation. All of these different worship styles have their strengths, and of course they have their weaknesses, and each can be done well, and each can be done terribly. But often in my world, it seems like none of those three worship styles feels like a really authentic one for me to embrace as Unitarian Universalist. It seems like there's this either or spectrum, and we're going to see a couple of examples of these either or on a video, and Lori will set that up right now. So both of those video clips lift up worship that scares me a little. I definitely don't want to go into a worship service that seems so quiet and sedate. And I also don't want to go into a church where everybody's up and dancing and feeling so free. That's just not exactly what I'm looking for on Sunday morning. So I imagine and name another way that we have as Unitarian Universalists, and I call it a vital and vibrant worship. And look closely at that image you see on your screen, because you may see people you know in that photograph. Those are real, live Unitarian Universalists boogieing and laughing and singing at the end of the Service of Living Tradition this past June. It was amazing. I had really never experienced anything like it in my years as a churchgoer. And so to me, that looks like vital and vibrant worship happening there. And if any of you were there, just kind of type in on the chat box and let me know. I'd love to know. So when I say that worship is vital, what I'm talking about is worship that connects us to the community that we're part of. and the larger cultures, plural, that we walk in. And it's not just about who is in the four walls of your church, but it's about who lives in the neighborhood outside of your church. What are the major issues of your community? What are the sounds and smells and taste of your neighborhood? How can you incorporate those in a meaningful way into worship? And I give you one example here on those images. The altar at my congregation often showcases vegetables from our vegetable garden. And that garden's been a huge driver of growth for our congregation. Many Sundays also, our choir welcome song incorporates a garden or a nature theme. Vital worship connects to the mission of your church. And vital worship also connects with issues that face our communities. And when something is happening, we find a way to name it or address it in worship. And it doesn't always have to be overtly in a sermon, but through pastoral prayer or a story for all ages or a reading. And vital worship also connects us directly to our faith as Unitarian Universalists, our rich heritage and our roots, our living tradition, both the times that we are so proud of, the miracle stories that we love to tell, and the times we regret that maybe we'd like to change, but times that we can learn from. So those are characteristics of the vital part of worship. And then there's also the vibrant part of worship. And vibrant worship is one that speaks to us on many levels. Next week, when you take the webinar with Reverend Matthew Crary, you'll hear him talk about multiple intelligences, a concept that was first created, or at least that became well known, by Howard Gardner. And you can find out more about those multiple intelligences here at this website. And if you really want to get some gold stars for next week's webinar, you can go on to that website and learn all you can and really impress Reverend Matthew next week with how much you already know about that. By being intentional in every worship, by having at least one liturgical element speak to those ways of knowing the world throughout worship, you stand a greater chance that every person who comes through those doors will find something that will speak to their mind and heart. Someone will come into worship this Sunday with his heart broken, and someone will be there with her heart ready to sing out for joy. As a worship leader, your challenge is to create a container where each of those people can have an authentic engagement with those feelings and also to touch the sacred. Which liturgical elements of worship speak most to your heart and mind? We're going to do a poll now that Lori will set up, and we'll give you all about a minute there's 5 choices in the poll, and so you'll be able to make a choice. And I was limited to 5, and it was hard to choose the 5. So just kind of roll with me, if you will, with what's up there. And if your absolute favorite isn't in that 5, I'd love for you to just put it there in the chat screen so we can capture it. And as I watch the polling come up on the screen, and I actually don't know if everyone can see that or if only presenters can see your votes roll in. But it occurred to me that depending on the week and what's going on in my own life, probably the element that speaks most to me, it may change based on what's happening and how I'm feeling. So it looks like if everyone has voted, that music got the most with 7. And, that's no surprise. I mean, music is so important in worship. And because of that, we're dedicating a whole webinar in this series on the use of music in worship. And that'll be at the end of the month on October 30th with Reverend Wendy Bartell, who had done time as a choir director before she went into seminary and became ordained. So that's on October 30th. And we'll touch just a little bit on music tonight. Lori, thank you so much for running the poll. I really appreciate it. And then I don't know if everyone can see it, but music was number 1, followed by words, followed then each with 1 vote, with silence and meditation, with dance or movement, and then visual art. Perfect. So again, Vital and Vibrant Worship is about a worship experience that's heart-opening, soul-satisfying, thought-provoking, and steeped in the surrounding community and culture. This kind of worship doesn't just happen on its own, and those of you that have spent time coordinating and pouring your heart and soul into worship know that is true. It's tough. It's tough to get vital and vibrant worship. I strive for it every week, and on a good Sunday, I think that parts of worship live up to it, and then other parts of worship fall short. It takes a lot of intention, and if y'all on the computer aren't paying attention to the chat box, Amanda Aikman has some good jokes going on over there, and I highly recommend that you check them out. And so this intention about vital and vibrant worship, I break it down into 4 P's. Oh, Amanda's saying no, that's not a joke. Thank you, Amanda. You're making a good point. So 4 P's, and I call those 4 P's purpose, presence, preparation, and presiding. And so purpose, why in the world do we do worship? Why do we wake up on, for most of us, a Sunday morning? Some of you may do worship at another time of the week. Why do we do that? And if your fingers are limber and ready, go ahead and type your own answers into the chat box. Why do we worship? So I'm sure that to help remember what's important, to connect with each other and the larger world, to come together as community, to name what is worthy, to celebrate life, to connect, to engage the sacred in life, to find a sense of grounding internally, to connect with something greater than ourselves, to practice my connection to all expressed publicly. Those are beautiful. I hope that, Lori, I don't know if we can save all these things that get put into the chat, but I hope that we can. To practice what it means to be human. I love that one. And it looks like that came from Wendy Bartell, one of our future webinar presenters. To connect with the divine, to share with like-minded individuals. Amen. So I narrowed those down to 2, and since you don't have a way to really verbally feedback on this, we'll just have to agree to hold 2 of them right now. And it's to be able to touch and be amazed by the mystery and wonder of life, and to connect with one another through meaningful community. And I think about that, everything we do in church is all about love with a capital L. We come together to learn to love ourselves and then love our neighbors. And when we do that, we're able to love the sacred, and we're able to go out and then love the world. And that's a spiral, not a linear progression. And we're about that work throughout our lifetime. And worship is one of the best ways we have to encourage people into that community of love and to give people the space to touch the sacred. You know, when people come into worship not hungry for more information, they can get the answers to pretty much anything by Googling it. But what they can't Google is an experience of awe. We can't manufacture or arrange an experience of awe to just erupt during our worship service. But we can do what we can to get out of the way and clear the clutter so there's a possibility that it can happen. And I'll say more about that, setting the stage, in a few moments. And then the other reason, community. But it's a deeper community than just idle chatter during coffee hour. People yearn for a deeper connection with others, a chance to belong, and an opportunity for companionship. And that can happen in a lot of places, but why church? And we've named some of those whys. You know, church is this strange place that has rituals and customs that most of us don't engage in any other time of the week. One reason is that healthy church communities call on us to be our authentic selves. It's a place where people are taken care of and where together we reach out to touch the divine and try to make sense of that together. So being clear about the purpose of what worship is about will help you in that next step, which is presence. And this presence is all about you. And no worship leader worth her salt climbs into the pulpit or the chancel on Sunday morning without having spent a considerable amount of time tending to the inner self. When I did my ministerial internship, I told my supervisor that, I meditated for 5 minutes a couple of times a week. And his response to me was, you better spend a lot more time than that if you're planning to preach regularly. You know, what do you need to do to take care of yourself so that you are centered enough so that you can step into the pulpit and hold that amazing container of worship for people? Like I said a few minutes ago, there are folks in the room carrying so many different emotions, and you are holding that container during the time of worship. What are ways that you take care of your spirit? Whether it's meditation or gardening or listening to loud rockin' music or riding your bicycle or watching silly cat videos. You know, what is it that gives yourself a chance to calm down, turn off a bit of your monkey mind, breathe in deeply, and feel that connection with the still small voice? Mark has written in that painting is a way that he does that, and I encourage others of you, I want to see what are ways that you take care of your spirit. You can type it there into the chat box. There's sewing and knitting, listening to music and taking walks, singing, that's one of mine. Creative cooking, I'd love to come over, Laurie. There's gardening. Margaret, I'd like you to come over here. Hiking, gardening, please come to my house. Talking with spiritual director, gardening and walking. Walking by the woods and stream, meditation and walking. Walking in the woods, especially in the rain, and that's coming from Dennis on Whidbey Island. Reading, cross-country, skiing and hiking. Swinging and watching the beautiful creation. looking at the stars, walking outside. Thank you all. You can keep going. Oh, playing the ukulele. I'm learning to play guitar and also view that as a spiritual practice. And the ukulele is coming all the way from Kingston, New York. Barbara, so glad you're with us. So we've gone through 2 of the P's, and then the third one is the preparation. And this is a sweet spot for those perfection types among you. This preparation is about paying careful attention to ways that your worship space, your worship materials, your liturgy is enhancing or detracting from people being able to connect with the mystery and wonder and with the community. So whether you're worshiping in a 1920s mission Gothic-style sanctuary or renting space at a senior center or somewhere in between, of course, the way you set up your worship space matters. Please, I hope none of you write into the chat box and tell me that your worship space looks like this image on your computer screen. That would get a big no for me. But what is the first thing that worshipers see on a Sunday morning? Do they see a cluttered entryway or a cluttered worship area with a lot of visual background noise, like these old Trader Joe's bags or just meaningless clutter? Is it possible to make way for mystery and wonder with all that going on? Or do they see a worship space that's grounded in your church's mission, that creates a possibility of connection with wonder and mystery, conducive to building meaningful community? Religious educator Maria Harris talks about implicit, explicit, and null curriculum that all serve to enlighten us about the values and teachings of our churches. Our use of space tells an implicit, inferred story to others about how we value our time together in worship. And really, no matter what kind of worship space you have inherited, you have the ability to adapt it to suit your needs. When people arrive at your church, is it clear how they're going to get into your worship space? Or does it feel confusing? My church has multiple entrances. They all face different streets. And it's really hard to tell how to get in, especially during the winter when we want to keep the doors shut. And so once someone does find their way into your building, is there a clear flow into your worship area? Or will a newcomer have to search around for your sanctuary? Also, we talked about how community is such an important part of worship. And is there a place for people to gather and make connections both before and after worship? Then also with the preparation, there's the liturgy, which is the words and the ceremonies that we use during public worship. Your goal is a well-planned liturgy that flows and helps people connect with the mystery and wonder. And what you want is for people to notice the artful beauty of the worship service. You want them to notice the rituals, the music, the deep silence, the prayers, and you even want them to notice the words of worship. After this webinar, if you Google the images for liturgical flow, you'll get a lot of complicated flow charts. But really, at the basic, just keep in mind that the energy, the tempo of worship needs to change during your time together. Think about it as waves hitting the shore or inhaling and exhaling. If worship is done only on a high note with a lot of like raucous happenings and, loud, energetic music, well, your people may be exhausted and on sensory overload by the end of the worship, right? You've only been able to hit one level of energy and emotion. And if you keep the energy too low, well, how many of us have looked out on a Sunday morning and seen a scene similar to this one? We'll just have to assume that that guy was up really late with his spiritual practice. Maintaining the flow in worship, it's an art form and it takes practice. So what are the moments of high energy or higher energy in your worship services? You can just type it in over here to the left. And if you all have seen the chat box, Amanda was sharing that one UU congregation's website had a video that showed the approach into the church building, maybe from the parking lot. I think that's great. And so the question, someone asked to repeat the question, and I'd like to know, what are the moments of higher energy in your church's worship service? And so there's hymn singing and greeting, joys and concerns and music, the greeting each other. Yes, people love to say hi and give hugs as people arrive, the choir singing. Wonderful. And then for those of you that have talked about the higher energy moments, then what are some of the moments where that liturgical flow comes down a little bit, more of a kind of restful time in worship? The pastoral prayer for sorrow and joys, the moment of silence, the pastoral prayer, meditation, listening to special music, yeah, the meditation. And we do a centering hymn in my church that's usually on the downhill slide there. Thank you. So I put up my, like a typical Tera little worship flow, and I think this is a, pretty typical kind of Protestant-y worship flow. I grew up Methodist and, have been Unitarian Universalist for a long time. And so this is a flow that feels really authentic to me. And I'm going to pause for a minute. Amanda, quick fingers on the computer, she found the video of someone approaching a UU church, so you can catch it over there in the chat box. Thank you, Amanda. That we really try to start worship with a bang, with the choir welcome song and high energy opening hymns. We sing a lot at my church. We usually do 5 hymns and then 3 other musical pieces. And then you can see on this chart, it kind of winds itself around. I'm serving a small congregation, and I feel like serving a small church really gives an opportunity to do some things in worship that maybe if we had 150 people or 250 people, it would be harder to do. And so pretty much every week, we have some kind of community ritual that we do during worship. Now, sometimes that's our celebrations and compassions, which a lot of people call joys and sorrows. But other times it's a ritual that has to do with the theme of the worship service. So an example of that is during our new member Sunday, we had a ritual where people were able to come up and place a stone in a bowl of water that represented their intention for the future of our congregation. And then that one also turned into a hug ritual of sorts that was unexpected, but someone started, hugging me after they put their stone in. And then pretty soon, all the folks who came down to participate in it were giving me a hug. Even people, that was their very first time in church, and I never met them before and didn't know their name. And I felt like that really just lifted up the fact that, you know, a lot of people want touch. They want that kind of even physical human connection. And then, you know, with this worship flow, my partner calls that end one with the preaching, closing hymn, and benediction. He calls that my grand finale because I call it celebratory, you know, but I usually end my sermons with a lead-in right into the closing hymn. That's a very high-energy closing hymn, and then at the end of worship, again, because we're a small congregation, I want to capitalize on that. You know, people are standing up, they're singing. We often try to do a song where people can put their books down and clap and not need to look at the hymnal for that closing hymn. And then we all get in the big circle, and I extemporaneously benediction them out of there. I'm, you know, sending them forth, and we talk about how we are gathering them in this community and then scattering them out into the world. And Mark wrote in and said, 5 hymns? Yes, we love to sing in my church. And I usually preach for about 12 to 15 minutes because we do multi-generations in worship. We, you know, have people of all ages from a 3-month-old to a 99-year-old. And so for us, a shorter sermon is what works, and having more movement and more singing in it works for us. Alrighty, so flatlining and worship, don't do it, you guys. And I got that term, flatlining, from Marcia McPhee. She's a fabulous worship arts teacher, and some of you may have done some work with her at other times. She did a conference with Unitarian Universalists in San Diego back in 2007-ish. And she has many free videos on YouTube that are great about all different aspects of worship art. And after our webinar, Lori will send out an email to all of you, and in the email it includes a 1-page Tera Little's favorite worship resources list. And so Marcia McPhee's website is on that. But you can also go to YouTube and just Google her name. So this thing about flatlining that she warns people about, these are things that can drag worship down, and they can pop up out of nowhere. So, you know, it's things like having too much of a single medium back to back. So if it's like all songs for 15 minutes or a really, really long invocation, you know, people are thinking like, what's happening? I just got in here, and, you know, all of a sudden we're sitting here listening to one voice for a really long time. It's things like if you're having a liturgical disaster. An example is in my congregation, we are continually having microphone problems. And, you know, I've learned as a worship leader that I have to be on top of it and fearless about just walking up and like helping to fix whatever the microphone problem is. So, you know, some other flat lines that Marcia McPhee names are things like extremely long sermons or really long verbal transitions in between pieces, you know, silence that is too short or silence that is too long, silence that's very awkward. And so part of this preparation then is giving a lot of thought to transitions, the transitions in worship. And it's a little bit like dancing when you think about it. You know, when you're dancing, you have these individual moves that you're doing, but unless you're doing a robot dance, you know, the dance moves really flow in and out of each other so that they feel like all of one piece. So prepare for these transitions. And if you take only one thing away from this webinar tonight, I really, really hope that you'll take away the sense of urgency around paying close attention to these transitions in worship. In my own church, when we're not paying attention to transition, those are the times I most sense that flatlining happening. So as you ready your worship script for Sunday, mentally walk through how will you get from one piece to the other, and look through your script, and wherever you've typed in the words, and now we will, I want you to erase that and never, ever write it into your worship script again. So some worship transition tips. Plan a walkthrough of every worship transition with each person who's participating in worship. So at my church, people who are participating have a leadership role, arrive 45 minutes early, and we do a walkthrough and we do a sound check, and anyone who has a speaking part speaks some of that into the mic. They learn how to adjust the mic, how close to stand to it. Then second, remember that silence is your friend in worship. Sometimes that can be the most powerful part. And I know sometimes silence can be hard, but really, I think that so much of that being able to connect with the sacred and worship happens in those down moments and the time of silence. Also, when you're walking up into the pulpit or the chancel, it's okay to have a pause and to breathe in between those elements. It's not a relay race. Don't run up to the microphone talking on your way unless you're encouraging people to leave the church because of a fire or an emergency. Write out that transition language if that helps you. I am always afraid I'm going to freeze in the moment, so I write out everything I'm going to say. That's just my personality and what helps me. And, when I'm having a really good day, I'm able to riff with the energy that's happening in worship. I have a great relationship with my music director, and, she and I can get a little jokey at the beginning of worship, which is good. It doesn't always happen. Also, if there's a certain word or a certain phrasing that you want people to pick up on, in a reading or in a hymn, you might say something about that as you move into that piece. And with hymns, you can turn instructions like turn now to hymn number 1000 into liturgical nudges. Like, as we begin our time in worship with hymn number 1000, let us sing this song of gladness and praise of this beautiful day, or something like that. I'm going to pause and let folks know that Wendy and Amanda are having an interesting discussion over here in the chat box about some other phrases in worship, like, this is the time in our service when we, and if you do that once, that's okay. I'm not going to come to your church and give you a demerit, but it's just that when those things happen between every liturgical element, it gets very tiring on people's ears. Some other worship transition tips are using musical refrains, either instrumental or vocal. They can help move the congregation from one element to another. And, a really beautiful thing can be to just have one small piece of a musical refrain that you use during different parts of worship. And then the closing hymn maybe is the full piece of that one little bit. And finally, and this is great, my final one, because it completely has to do with what's going on in the chat box. You can also let the order of service be the guide. So I don't feel like you need to have a spoken or a musical transition between every single element of the service. And I see that Jean and I are wondering how this all works out with the lay-led fellowship. And I think that's a great question, but I'm not exactly sure, Mark, what you and Jean are asking. So can you be a little bit more specific with your question about how this all works out with a lay-led fellowship? I'm just not sure exactly which piece of what I've said you're asking about. So I'll keep my eye on the chat box and move on, and then when I see your more specific question, I'll get to it. And so then our fourth P is presiding. Presiding. And no pressure, but again, people, this is all about you. And one of my favorite blogs to read about claiming your worshipful authority, whether you are ordained or lay, is Beauty Tips for Ministers. And it is way more than hair and lipstick. She goes into much deeper theological issues about how we present ourselves and what we communicate in the act of leading worship. And so some practical skills for presiding, just like anything, imagine yourself doing it. What do you imagine yourself looking like when you are up there in front of people and doing the sacred duty of leading worship? And become transparent. And what I mean by that is to remember that even though I just said this part's all about you as a worship leader, worship isn't all about you at all. It's about making space for each person to have her connection with the sacred. And again, it's like you're holding that container out in front of you. Every Sunday morning before worship, I say a prayer for myself and sometimes my music director, a prayer for us that includes a reminder that no matter what happens in worship, that it's really not about me. It's not about my sermon. It's not about how well I do with the transition. It's really about the people. And the worship is theirs. The worship is ours. And I'm just there to help facilitate that experience for them. Another little practical tip for presiding is to pay attention to your gestures. So often I see someone in a pulpit and they're making hand gestures, but they're little teeny tiny hand gestures like I would use to you when we're hanging out having coffee, not when I'm in front of people. And so, really think about it. And if you notice that you're doing little hand gestures right in front of yourself, why don't you practice opening them up a little bit? It helps people see what you're doing, and it helps lend a little bit of extra into worship for people to see you do that. And I see these questions on the side, and I'm going to actually answer those when I get to to my last slide, which is imminent. Think about also, what are your focal points? When you're presiding and then someone else is doing something like leading a song or doing a reading or coming up for joys and sorrows, it's really important for you as a worship leader to keep your gaze and your attention focused on them. So please don't be, drifting off. Don't be looking at your phone. Really pay attention to them. That lifts up the importance of what that person is doing in worship. And then singing. Oh my goodness, what happens if you're singing and you've got the microphone right in front of you and you feel like you don't necessarily want to sing into the microphone so that everyone can hear you so well? Sometimes I put the book up a little bit more so that the microphone is not going to come right and up to my mouth like that. And I love singing, and I don't think I'm a terrible singer, but I don't always want myself to be broadcast out to the whole congregation so that they can't hear themselves. But do, as a worship leader, participate in the singing. And, not knowing what anyone's worship space looks like, I actually move out from behind the pulpit at my church and move into the middle of our chancel. I just think that visually that's kind of a better look and a better feel for kind of what's going on when we're all singing together. And then again, the silence. Silence can be your friend in worship, and don't be afraid of it. Embrace it. And sometimes it's good to let it hang there. I mean, some of the moments that happen in worship are really powerful, and we don't want to be too quick to cover it up or move on. We want to let people sink into the depth of what just happened. There's readings, and there's all sorts of, practices that people can do with getting better at leading reading and worship. And a few things that I'll lift up right now: practice, practice, practice. Enunciate very clearly so people can hear you. And also think about which words and which phrases in this reading are important. Why did I choose it? What do I want people to get out of it? And vary your tone and your pace when you're doing it. It really helps people hear what's happening in that reading, much more so than if you just read it all the way through with one tone. And you can record yourself, you can have a friend listen to you, but really feel like, where's the power in that for you? And that's what you want to convey to the people listening. They may hear a different part of that reading that speaks to their heart and mind, but if you can find it, if you can find that for you, it can make like an goosebumpy moment for folks in worship. And Amanda is saying that repeating a reading or phrases can work really great, especially with poetry. If you're leading prayer in worship, be authentic, whether that is a prayer that's written out or something that you pray extemporaneously. And I would love to see more Unitarian Universalists be able to pray really like what's on their heart and on their mind. And I know from experience that it seems scary, but it can also be really beautiful and allow you to be in the moment and make a real connection with folks in the congregation. And I'm not going to give any practical tips on preaching because a gazillion books have been written about that. And I have some of my favorite books on preaching in the resource list that you'll get. But, clearly, I feel like I have so much to learn with preaching, and that is going to be an art that I practice and hopefully get better at through my whole lifetime. So finally, people want to leave worship feeling inspired and full of hope. You, as worship leader, are releasing them into the world to do the good work of Unitarian Universalism. You are releasing them so they can love themselves, love their neighbors, love their God, however they choose to name it or not, and then to love and heal the world. That's what we're all about. And when you are leading worship, people want to hear your warmth and authenticity. They want to hear that as much and more than the beautiful words you've chosen for worship that day. So really, just tune into that beautiful self that you are and let that shine. That's what people are going to pick up on. Let that shine forward. And so here we are at 7:58, and I am wondering, are there any questions that you want to put in this sidebar? And some folks are talking about how many words in a sermon, and Margaret Kite says, rightly so, almost 3,000 words in 12 minutes is an awful lot. I would be speaking really quickly at that point. I lifted that up about my 12 to 15 minutes because that's what works for me and my congregation. I don't necessarily think there are any hard or fast rules about that. I've been to worships where the sermon was 25 minutes, and I never wanted the sermon to end. It was so beautiful. So I hear a question. I see a question here. When we have many participants and no central control, and I think this is from the lay-led worship, what are some ideas from other lay-led fellowships to pull it all together? Well, do you have enough central control that you guys could try monthly worship themes so that it doesn't feel like every month, it's all over the place? Mark, do you think that would be helpful? And I wonder if any other people have any ideas for Mark about when it's lay-led and there's no central person making decisions. Any great ideas? And then the other thing I'm wondering, Mark, is if your congregation has a worship team or, who's kind of in charge. You said there's no central control, but is there a group or groups that have some investment over what happens on Sunday? Eleanor suggests that you can have a lay-led worship committee that creates the order of service. So it's 8 o'clock, and I want to be really aware of people's time and that it's 8 o'clock and people have worked all day, and I don't know if you've had dinner or not, and you might be really hungry. Thank you so much for being on this webinar. It's my first one, so you were all my guinea pigs today. Thank you very much. It was interesting. So for those of you that need to get on with your lives, please do so. and it was great to have you here. I hope to see you in person or on Facebook at some time. But if you have a few minutes, and if Lori has a few minutes, if people do have questions and you want to stay on, Lori says she's scheduled until 8:15 if people want to stay, and so I'll hang out here, and if you have any questions or discussion, I'd be happy to do that. And thanks for everybody who is sending your thank yous on the chat box. And also reminder to tune in to our next two webinars. Reverend Matthew Crary will do one that's specifically around use of technology in worship. And then Wendy Bartell, who is on with us tonight, will be doing one that's focused on worship and, music in small congregations. Thank you, Barbara, for coming all the way in from New York. Amanda, it looks like Mark is still here. And Mark, Amanda found your question very interesting. So it sounds like she'd like to have a little chat action going on. And Margaret lifts up that many lay speakers tend to speak too quickly and that preaching is acting. Yes, I would love to have time to explore the link to performance. You know, some people really shy away from the idea that worship is a performance because I think somehow they imagine that that makes it less authentic, less real. But, you know, it's definitely part performance. And Marge, if you want to say anything more about that, I would love to see what you have to say in the chat box. Lori lifts up in the chat box that when we do close, there's a survey for everybody to take. And then, Mark, you had asked about the, you know, kind of how to keep things, I think, more focused. And one of the resources that we have in the Pacific Western region is a publication called the Touchstones Journal, and that is published out of the Mountain Desert District. And it's a monthly journal, and they're arranged by monthly themes. And the journal has sections on worship and sections about small group ministry that and these are geared toward small congregations that don't have ministers. So if you guys aren't already hooked into the Touchstone Journal, I would recommend that you guys, you know, at least get a sample so you can check it out. And then over in the chat box, there's some conversations about the performance and how that would be a really valuable, I think, to do even a whole webinar or half a webinar on that, because there's definitely, you know, it brings up a lot of emotions for people. And Harold says that they're using Touchstones both for worship and a community outreach program meetup. Oh, Harold, I would love to know more about that. And that if the Mountain Desert District doesn't know that you're using it like that, they would probably love to know about that. Yeah, that's a great idea. Very cool. Oh, yay, Wendy gives affirmation. Oh, good. Lori says if there's no more questions, we could hear my closing. That sounds great. And oh, just so you know, Harold put up the link for their meetup, so folks can see that in the chat box. And so if you guys, for our closing words, well, let's join hands virtually. And I give thanks for the mystery and the beauty of this crazy universe that has enabled us to connect across state borders and across time zones to explore worship and what it means in our lives, how we can go into it more deeply, how we can help give space, provide that container to touch that which is sacred in their lives. Good night, you all. Amen. Blessings. Thank you for being here.